what appears to be an avalanche of cases of public corruption in the El Paso area in the last few years. Richard Schwein, former special agent in charge for the El Paso division of the FBI, is here to provide us with some insights. Welcome, and we're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, are there really more cases than usual here in El Paso in recent years?
I think the government set a priority on public corruption nationwide and put the resources in to address it. And these cases came to light, but it's been going on, we're sure, for a long, long time.
Okay. So, is El Paso worse than other areas, do you think? Or, I mean, statistically speaking, it seems like we have a lot more public corruption cases going on than other areas, or is that just our perception?
That may well be a perception. In this country, public corruption is nothing new. We have 17 mafia families in the United States, and they're experts in corrupting things. However, here, sort of isolated in the Southwest, it's concentrated, and it's impacted nearly all of our political bodies.
Really? Now, why is it concentrated here in the Southwest?
Well, because we're the one big city sitting here in this part of the Southwest.
So it has
and there's
to
lots of money here, tax money.
Oh, really?
All this money taken is citizens' money.
Right.
Governments don't make money, they
Right.
take money.
Yeah, that's true. Does it being on the border have anything to do with it more so, do you think?
I think there's a perception that there's corruption on the border, but there's corruption everywhere. It seems on the border, our neighbors to the south certainly have corruption problems, but we have our own set of problems here. The difference is if you're caught here and tried here, there's a consequence. If you're convicted, and as many of these people have been, or plead guilty, and you're sentenced to prison, a federal prison, there's no parole. Whatever they give you, you do.
Why is there no parole in a case like of public corruption versus murder or?
There's no parole period in the federal system.
Uh-huh.
There's probation if you're a first offender, but if you are sentenced to 5 years or 10 years, you must do 85% of it before they'll even consider you for early release for good behavior, unlike the state systems.
Oh, okay.
Congress did away with parole years ago.
Huh. I did not know that. I learned something new today.
When I was a young agent, I worked bank robberies for 7 years, and we'd sentence an armed robber to 25 years, and he'd be out in 2, no more.
Oh. Well, I think that's probably good news. Yeah, from
a law enforcement standpoint,
yeah,
we certainly
right.
think it is.
Why do you think they did away with it at the federal level but not the state level?
Well, I can't speak to the state legislatures, but on the federal level, the recidivism is so bad that you lock the people up. And you start with probation usually for first offenders, but if it's a violent crime or a crime where lots of money's stolen, then there's a penalty to pay.
Why do you think that the federal government decided to put more resources toward public corruption more recently than in the past?
Federal money. Most of the money, most of the embezzlements and corruption here are federal dollars. That's where the FBI has jurisdiction when federal funds are involved. And probably 70–80% of the money comes from the federal government.
And so they're basically trying to protect
the taxpayer.
Their taxpayer and their income stream and and their investment in.
Well,
yeah.
Even some of the people involved in this, I've even said in the past, it's sort of like the amateur hour. They sell their offices for a minimal amount of money, but they cost the taxpayers lots of money. For example, perhaps $150 million worth of contracts might actually be worth $100 million if it was done properly.
So, why is addressing the issue of public corruption so important, other than just the moral issue and so forth? What happens if we don't address that issue?
People will keep stealing our money, your money, my money. The children will suffer, and the schools, of course. So the school districts are big. They have big bucks. I know my property taxes, the highest percentage goes to the school district.
Right.
And rightly so. Our kids deserve a good education, but not when the money's stolen.
Right. Yeah. And so it actually has a very tangible effect on society and on the quality of life when public corruption is occurring.
Absolutely, it affects all of our citizens. One of the sad things is it doesn't have to happen. People don't vote in this city for whatever reason. When I was in Puerto Rico, which is a political hotbed, their parties, 60–70% of the people will vote in an election. They don't always vote for the best person, maybe, but they vote. Here, we're lucky to get 20%.
Yeah.
So it's not that hard to manipulate an election and put the wrong people in office, and they promptly steal.
That's interesting. So from that standpoint, voter turnout does affect the ethics of government.
Absolutely. Voter turnout and not knowing who the candidates are, not studying the issues, or not paying attention. Right. And we're paying a terrible price for it.
Now, there have been a number of public corruption cases lately, and if people would have known the background of most of these individuals who were indicted, would we have selected somebody different? Were these people who had a history of doing this kind of thing?
I don't think necessarily, but once they're in office, there seem to be no checks and balances. For example, we have a school board who's supposed to oversee expenditures and contracts. They did not. Mm-hmm. And now we're paying an awful price with that one school district.
Can you tell us about that case? That's a pretty big case.
Well, I only could tell you, since I'm retired, I don't have an insight into the...
Yeah.
But basically, the superintendent is charged with a phony contract, $400,000. Yeah. And apparently no one checked to see anything about it. Mm-hmm. It was a sole source bid.
Right.
Well, you know, you can check a sole source. Is that the only person that could provide this service?
Right.
You could Google that and find out real quick.
Right, yeah.
Apparently no one did.
Yeah.
They just accepted whatever he said.
Right, yeah. And so the whole issue of having checks and balances is a key to prevent.
Exactly. That's why they allegedly have internal auditors who do this. Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't be necessary for the United States government to have criminal investigations. It should stop long before that.
Yeah. So how does the FBI decide that they're going to pursue a particular case?
Well, usually it's a complaint from a citizen or from someone in the government itself, mm-hmm. saying, hey, we have this case, it's federal money, it's X thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands or procurement fraud, whatever it might be, and they would start an investigation under one of the appropriate title, United States Code, and then they would go to the United States Attorney and say, this is what we have. If there's a case there, will you prosecute? And the U.S. Attorney would say, yay or nay, because it's their decision as to whether there's a prosecution. And in this town, the United States Attorney's Office here is very tuned to public corruption, and they'll say yes, and they'll prosecute and have prosecuted.
Now, could someone use this as a vendetta against somebody? You know, if you wanted to retaliate, say you didn't like a colleague or something like that, could you? Could
you make an accusation?
Yes,
certainly, but hopefully a good investigator would resolve that very rapidly. You have to have evidence.
Right.
In a federal case, you do the investigation, then you go to a grand jury, and they decide usually whether charges are going to be preferred. So there's a system of checks all the way up until charges are finally drawn. And these are slow-moving cases. You're talking lots of money and books to go through and traces to make. So it's not like a bank robbery where the robber comes in, gets his picture taken by the cameras, and bingo, he's in jail, or she.
Mm-hmm. Now, how long would it take typically to investigate a case? I'm sure it could vary
a lot. It would vary.
I
think Enron, the big case, took years to go through those books and find all the fraud. Mm-hmm. Here it hasn't taken nearly as long, but still it takes a significant amount of time, because we have to trace all those expenditures, which are legitimate, which are not. When you talk about, there are three phases in corruption. There's waste, fraud, and abuse. And when you get to abuse, you're getting into criminal conduct. Waste isn't necessarily criminal, but it still costs us a lot of money.
Right.
The federal government, every agency in the federal government has an inspector general who's an independent officer who reports usually to the head of the agency, and that's their job, to look at waste, fraud, and abuse. Some cities, a retired friend of mine in Dade County, Florida, is the inspector general for that because they found a need to have someone locally doing these investigations. I would think that maybe we need it here.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like it. Now, recently there was the case for the El Paso County where I think $3.2 million was, I guess, stolen from the taxpayers, and there have been some other very sensational cases. Which are the ones that have stood out to you recently as being noteworthy?
I think the school, to me,
school,
as a taxpayer.
The EISD?
Yes, that, and then the city of Socorro, the charges there. And,
How about
and county judges, in El Paso, our elected officials, what are 2 or 3 who were county judges.
And so, most of these people, do they set out to think that I am going to defraud the taxpayer, or do they just kind of slip into these things? Take us into the mind of a corrupt public official for a minute.
You have to. There are 2 sets, let's say. There's a person who's elected and wants to do right, but they find out other people are making a few bucks on the side. It's the way business is done. So they'll slip you a few dollars if you vote this way, and who's going to get hurt? And then there's the official that takes office, planning to steal when they take office. So, and they usually get the big dollars.
Right.
Some of the people who've been indicted, pled guilty, or are awaiting trial, the actual amounts of money that they personally got are small. But the cost to the taxpayers is big.
Right. Yeah. And so, most of the time, it's kind of a process of justifying in their minds, well, this is no big deal, who's going to get hurt, I don't get paid much anyway, or I don't get paid at all for this, so this is a way I can be compensated. Is that...
There used to be a thing called the Good Old Boy Network,
right.
and it was all going to change, but it didn't. It's the same thing. It's the old, I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine, and we'll all make $1 here, $1 there.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been suggested in another organization I belong to is that we should start teaching ethics in business schools more than we do now. And certainly a person who takes a government office, they take an oath.
Right.
They raise their right hand and swear to uphold the law and do the right thing. And apparently that doesn't mean much to some people.
Yeah, right. Now, you got into the FBI as a young man, is that right?
Actually, yeah.
What was your career path?
I was going to a teacher's college in Ohio and on a work-study program, and a recession came along, and I couldn't work in the factory and go to school, so the FBI hired me as a clerk, and I went to work and went to college while I worked as a support person, and now I was commissioned an agent. I spent 40 years in the Bureau, total.
Right, yeah. Now, you came to El Paso, and then you eventually took over the office as the chief special agent, right?
I came here as the agent in charge.
As the agent
Career
in charge.
paths in the FBI, I was what we call a street agent, an investigator for many years in Philadelphia primarily, in Birmingham, Alabama, Philadelphia, and in headquarters, and I was the assistant agent in charge in Cleveland, Ohio, and then an inspector in the FBI, and then I came here as the agent in charge in '87.
What's the challenge of working in El Paso versus other places?
every office, there are 56 FBI divisions. There are 4 in Texas. Here on the border, when I came here, it was drugs. The emphasis, when I came here, we had, I think, 35 agents. There are many more. There were a lot more when I left. But the director who came into office when I came here was William Sessions, who'd been a federal judge here. And he said, we have to work drugs here along with DEA. And so that was our emphasis. And that's still some emphasis, but then in public corruption, of course, now any FBI office is counterterrorism. And that's an issue on the border, obviously.
How big is the whole counter-terrorist issue here in El Paso? Is it?
It would be a top priority. How many agents that he has working, I have no idea.
So is the corruption generally related to at all other types of crimes, or is it usually kind of an isolated thing?
Corruption deals with the treasuries of various and sundry agencies, and I don't think there's necessary. Well, it impacts certain corporations, of course, that, for example, they sell a product and they bribe people to get that product. So you have the briber and the bribee, if you will. So,
right.
And both are felonies.
Right. Now, if in El Paso, one of the things is that we have a lot of international businesses, things that are cross-border type of things, Maquilas. Twin Cities, Maquilas, right? How does that affect the whole corruption issue?
You know, I don't think there's been a real problem that I've seen with the Maquilas. Here it's the government agencies that they're looking at. So it really is limited to mostly government agencies and then their relationship with various private enterprises. Or you could or of course the federal government regulates and investigates crimes and not bank robberies, but also internal thefts on banks. And Medicare fraud and Medicaid fraud, and so there's a whole range of issues.
Do you think that the public understands corruption and public corruption, or needs to appreciate it more, take it more seriously, or how does the public react to that?
I think from talking to people and reading the newspapers and watching various and sundry television shows, there's an acceptance. It's always been that way. It shouldn't be that way. It costs you money, but it's always been that way. It's the way business is done.
And so it's almost an apathy or a sense that there's nothing that can be done. There's always going to be a tolerance level for it.
And there shouldn't be.
And everybody's, most politicians or public officials are corrupt anyway.
Which isn't so. That's not so. But it's like in law enforcement, if we had one corrupt agent in the FBI, it tarred all of us with a brush.
Yeah.
And it's the same with a public official. If one county commissioner or school board official or is corrupt, then the perception is there must be a whole bunch of them. And that's not so. So
when corruption occurs, it is important for colleagues and so forth to try to inform the appropriate people as soon as possible, because it does reflect on the whole agency.
Of course.
So what is generally the fallout for agencies when they're, for example, EPISD? So what happens to that agency after a corruption scandal has occurred like that?
Well, there will be certain people who will go to prison, assuming that, well, we know there's been some guilty pleas. There's an ongoing investigation. There's a lot of money involved with EPISD, and hopefully they'll come up with a system to stop it, to make the school board more accountable, to do their job. And there's a perception they didn't, and I happen to agree with that perception. They just, I don't know what they did, but they let things go that they shouldn't have let go. Yeah. They're there as an oversight board, among other things.
Right.
That's why they're elected.
Well, if from the standpoint of all the different corruption cases that have been brought to bear, is that something which we're going to hopefully see on the decline now? Is there usually a lot of indictments and that sort of thing, and then things calm down, people become more careful, or you think this is going to continue to be a pattern of a lot of
I would hope that the publicity that's been brought to bear by all the media outlets on these corruption cases will make people say, hey, wait a minute, that's my money that they're stealing. Mm-hmm. And we elect people who won't steal money, mm-hmm. who do their duties, who due diligence is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It should never get to the criminal level, ever. There's no need for it. People in power who detect wrongdoing should handle it right now.
And so in your experience, this tends to be a deterrent for future people.
We would hope it's a deterrent. Yeah. Maybe I'm a little cynical, having worked in law enforcement for so many years, that crime will always be with us.
You'll always be in business, huh?
Yeah, as I sometimes facetiously say, crime pays. It paid my salary for 40 years.
Right.
And sadly.
Yeah.
Sadly. But it depends on the type of crime. But these people aren't going around with a gun in their hand and mugging people or hijacking cars. They're stealing. They're in official positions and they're stealing from the taxpayers.
If in terms of the perception of crime, I think that people tend to get less upset about, somebody, the whole white collar crime thing than violent crime,
Correct.
Even though it affects a lot more people.
Yeah, violent crime is because people get killed, they get hurt, and rightly so. It should be addressed vigorously. And I worked violent crimes for many years, but yeah, people shrug it off, white-collar crime, and they say, well, and someone gets convicted, they go to, quote, club fed.
Yeah.
Well, for those people who've never been to a federal prison, and I've been to many of them on the right side of the bars, mm-hmm. there's no such thing as a nice prison. Mm-hmm. You may be a white-collar criminal who's convicted and sentenced, and there may not be armed guards, but they'll tell you when to get up and when to go to bed and when to eat and when to shower, and you'll work. So here you are, maybe the head of a corporation or a government official, and now you're cleaning latrines or scrubbing pots and pans. Mm-hmm. So there's no such thing as a nice jail.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that is a perception out there that if you have white-collar crime, that it's a more
You're not going to a hard rock prison.
Right.
That's true. It's still a prison. You're locked up.
Right.
You have no freedom.
No freedom whatsoever. So they are housed together, so to speak, not with violent criminals, but...
Yeah, that's for safety's sake. There are certain people you would put in a violent prison and they'd be assaulted promptly, so you just don't do that.
Yeah, right. Now, this isn't part of your job description, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but do you think that there is, a spiritual dynamic or a spiritual component that comes into play with crime?
Well, I thought about that when you asked me to do this. In the history of the world, there have been church leaders who have been very corrupt. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's one, Jim, Baker?
Yeah, sure.
$10 million is what he was charged with. Uh-huh. So hopefully people who live up to their religious beliefs don't do things like this. Mm-hmm. But we know that it happens. I think Judas with 30 pieces of silver. So.
Right. Yeah, right. Now, as far as a particular area, I know that some people say that they think that El Paso has a greater presence of evil here than maybe in other places. Do you think that's true, just from your experience, or you just think it's...
I do not. For example, if you're talking about violent crime, we have one of the safest cities in the United States. The murder rate here for a city this size is extremely low. We have a very competent police force, so I wouldn't have stayed here in retirement if I thought it was an evil city.
Right. So you would not label El Paso an evil city?
No, yeah. I certainly would not.
Now, there's some people who say that, oh, they're just covering it up and they're hiding the murder rate. It's really much higher, or the cartels murder people over here and then dump the bodies in Juarez. I mean, could that actually be happening?
I suppose it could, but it's very. Someone's murdered over here. There's usually a body. I mean, we have what were there in the last couple of years? 5,000 or so murders across the river, and we had a dozen, maybe 20.
Right. So you believe, and you ought to know that El Paso is one of the safest cities.
Absolutely, and that doesn't mean we're safe from corruption and stealing money, but as far as your personal safety, this is one of the safest cities in the country.
Now, so it has to do with the competence of the police force mostly? What are the factors?
There are several factors. We have a very strong police force and a sheriff's office and a lot of federal officers here. You know, our citizens aren't really violent people by and large. I mean, we have our share of violent crime, but not like other cities. You go to Detroit or Chicago, or they're having an epidemic, or San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Right,
I
yeah.
worked at.
Right, Chicago's in the news a lot these days, that's for sure.
Puerto Rico had 1,000 homicides on that small island last year.
Well, that's...
So, and then look at our city of, 700,000
Right.
in the county? It's good.
Right. So so the whole issue of public corruption is one that's just going to help the city prosper more.
Doing away with it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
of course.
Yeah, right.
Your kids, if the money going to the school system is used properly, then I have grandkids, not kids anymore, but
Right.
they'll get a good education, which they deserve.
Right. So we really appreciate you being here and giving your insight. You know, it's hard to get someone to actually talk about these cases from the inside perspective. And so we appreciate your insights. And on this difficult issue, I think I've learned a lot about the whole issue of public corruption. So thank you
You're
so
very
much for
welcome.
being here. And in the midst of everything, I am reminded of what a blessing it is that we live in a country which stands for the rule of law. And we need to step up our prayers for our community and for the law enforcement agencies who uphold righteousness in our businesses and government affairs. Join in on the conversation on the social media. Thank you so much for watching.